September 19th, 1940. Warsaw, Poland. A Polish cavalry officer named Witold Pilecki does something that defies all logic, all survival instinct, all human reason. He walks deliberately into a German street roundup. He allows himself to be arrested by the Gestapo. He carries false identification papers, and he's doing this completely voluntarily. His destination? Auschwitz concentration camp, the place where over 1 million people would die, the place the Nazis designed specifically to break human beings, to destroy them mentally and physically, to erase their very humanity. And Witold Pilecki is choosing to go there. Not as punishment, not by accident, by choice. This is the story of the man who volunteered for hell, survived against impossible odds, built a secret army inside the death camp, escaped to tell the world what was happening, fought in one of the most brutal uprisings of World War II, and then was executed by the very country he risked everything to save. This is the story of the greatest hero you've never heard of, and it begins with an impossible decision that would change the course of history. Witold Pilecki stood in the apartment of his brother-in-law on Wojska Polskiego Street in Warsaw's Jolibars district. Outside, he could hear the sounds that had become routine in occupied Poland. German soldiers shouting in harsh voices, truck engines idling, the frightened whispers of civilians being rounded up like cattle. It was a Lepanka, a street roundup. The Germans conducted them regularly, grabbing anyone they found and sending them to concentration camps or forced labor. Most Poles hid when they heard the Germans coming. They locked their doors, stayed silent, prayed they wouldn't be discovered. Witold Pilecki did the opposite. He walked toward the door. His companions in the underground resistance tried to stop him. "Witold, what are you doing? They'll take you." Pilecki looked at them calmly. "That's exactly what I'm counting on." He had spent weeks planning this moment. He had acquired false papers identifying him as Tomasz Serafiński, a tanner by profession. He had memorized every detail of his fake identity. He had prepared himself mentally for what was coming. Because Witold Pilecki had volunteered for a mission that no rational person would accept, a mission that seemed like suicide. He was going to infiltrate Auschwitz concentration camp.
Reflective, respectful, building admiration. Witold Pilecki was born on May 13, 1901 in Olonets, Russia, where his family had been exiled by the Russian Empire for their involvement in Polish independence movements. From birth, Pilecki was part of a tradition of resistance, of fighting for freedom against overwhelming odds. His family returned to Poland when he was a teenager. Pilecki grew up during turbulent times. Poland had been partitioned for over a century, divided between Russia, Prussia, and Austria. When Poland finally regained independence in 1918, Pilecki was 17 years old, and he immediately joined the military to defend his newly free homeland. He fought in the Polish-Soviet War of 1919 to 1921, serving with distinction in cavalry units. He was young, but he proved himself brave, resourceful, and absolutely committed to Polish independence. After the war, Pilecki could have lived a comfortable life. He married Maria Ostrowska in 1931. They had 2 children, Andrzej and Zofia. He managed an estate in the countryside, living the peaceful life of a gentleman farmer. He was educated, cultured, deeply religious, a devout Catholic who attended Mass regularly. But when Germany invaded Poland on September 1st, 1939, Pilecki immediately mobilized. He formed a cavalry unit from local volunteers and fought against the German invasion. When the Polish military was overwhelmed by the simultaneous German and Soviet invasions and the Polish government fled into exile, Pilecki could have surrendered. He could have gone home to his family. Instead, he joined the underground resistance. The secret Polish army, later reorganized as the Home Army or Armia Krajowa, became Pilecki's new unit. And it was here, in the desperate month after Poland's defeat, that Pilecki encountered information that would lead to his most dangerous mission. The Germans had established a new concentration camp in the town of Auschwitz, which the Germans called Auschwitz. Thousands of Poles were being deported there. Rumors filtered back. Brutal conditions, starvation, death. But the resistance had no detailed intelligence. They didn't know what was happening inside the camp. They didn't know if prisoners could be organized. They didn't know if rescue was possible. Someone needed to go inside and find out. Someone needed to infiltrate Auschwitz, gather intelligence, organize resistance from within, and report back to the outside world. It was a mission with virtually no chance of survival. The person who went in would likely die there, but it was absolutely necessary. Someone had to do it. Witold Pilecki volunteered. His superiors in the resistance were shocked. "Witold, this is suicide. You know that." Pilecki's response was simple and direct. "Someone has to go. It might as well be me."
The plan was both simple and incredibly dangerous. Pilecki would assume a false identity. He would deliberately get himself arrested during a German roundup. He would be sent to Auschwitz with other prisoners. Once inside, he would gather intelligence, organize a resistance network, and find a way to communicate with the outside world. Then, if he survived, he would escape and deliver his report. Simple, and almost certainly fatal. On the morning of September 19, 1940, Pilecki prepared himself. He dressed in ordinary civilian clothes. He carried his false identity papers as Tomasz Serafiński. He memorized his cover story. He said goodbye to his wife and children, though he couldn't tell them where he was going or what he was about to do. Then, he walked into the trap. The German roundup swept through Warsaw's Żoliborz district systematically. Soldiers blocked off streets. They entered buildings. They dragged people out. Anyone they found was arrested. Pilecki didn't hide. He stood with other civilians as German soldiers approached. He was arrested, searched, and thrown into a truck with dozens of other terrified Poles. But unlike them, Pilecki was exactly where he wanted to be. The prisoners were taken to a temporary detention facility. Guards beat them randomly. They were given no food or water. They spent the night crowded into cold cells. In the morning, they were loaded onto cattle cars. The destination was announced: Auschwitz. The journey took hours. Over 2,000 men were crammed into railway cars designed for cattle. There was no room to sit, no sanitation, no ventilation. Men suffocated from the crush and heat. When the train finally stopped and the doors opened, Pilecki and the survivors stumbled out. What they saw was horrifying. A massive complex of barracks surrounded by electrified barbed wire fences, guard towers with machine guns, German SS officers with dogs, and a sign over the entrance: Arbeit macht frei. Work sets you free. It was a lie. This place was designed not to free people, but to destroy them. The SS guards immediately began the process of dehumanization. Prisoners were beaten savagely. They were stripped of their clothes and belongings. Their heads were shaved. They were given striped prison uniforms. And most importantly, they were given numbers. Witold Pilecki ceased to be a person. He became prisoner number 4859. Pilecki's first days in Auschwitz were a descent into hell. The camp operated on a system designed to break human beings physically and psychologically. Prisoners were woken before dawn. They stood for hours in roll call, regardless of weather. They were given starvation rations, watery soup, and a small piece of bread. They were forced to perform brutal physical labor, carrying heavy stones, digging ditches, building structures. And throughout it all, they were beaten constantly. Guards beat prisoners for working too slowly, for working too quickly, for looking at a guard, for not looking at a guard, for no reason at all. Death was everywhere. Prisoners died from starvation, from disease, from beatings, from execution. Bodies were carried out daily. The SS made it clear that prisoners were worthless, replaceable, disposable. Most prisoners broke within weeks. They lost hope. They lost the will to live. They became what the camp called Musulman, the walking dead. But Witold Pilecki was different. He had come to Auschwitz with a mission. And despite the horror surrounding him, despite the daily brutality, despite the constant threat of death, he began to work.
Quiet determination. Building hope amid darkness. Section 4. Organizing resistance inside Auschwitz seemed impossible. The SS had designed the camp specifically to prevent any form of organized opposition. Prisoners were kept in a constant state of exhaustion. They were starved, beaten, terrorized. Any prisoner caught communicating secretly with others was tortured and executed publicly as a warning. Trust was nearly impossible. The SS used informants, prisoners who betrayed others in exchange for slightly better treatment. One word to the wrong person meant death. But Pilecki had advantages. He was a trained military officer. He understood organization, communication, recruitment. He had exceptional judgment about people. He could identify who could be trusted and who couldn't. And most importantly, he had something most prisoners had lost: purpose. Pilecki began carefully. He identified prisoners who showed resilience, men who hadn't given up, men who still had fire in their eyes. He approached them cautiously, testing their reliability with small conversations. Where are you from? What did you do before? Do you have family? Simple questions that revealed character. When he identified someone trustworthy, Pilecki would take the next step. He would reveal that he was part of the Polish resistance, that there was a network outside working to fight the Germans, that they weren't alone. This simple knowledge that someone outside cared, that resistance continued, was incredibly powerful. It gave prisoners reason to hope, reason to survive. Pilecki organized his network brilliantly. He created cells of 5 men. Each man knew only his cell members. If one cell was compromised, the others remained safe. He recruited from different barracks, different work details, different nationalities. Poles, of course, but also Austrians, Germans, even some Soviet prisoners. Anyone who showed courage and could be trusted. The network had multiple purposes. First, mutual support. Members looked out for each other. They shared extra food when possible. They warned each other about dangerous guards. They helped sick members stay on their feet during roll call so they wouldn't be sent to the gas chambers. This alone saved lives. Second,
Intelligence gathering. Pilecki needed to know everything about the camp. How many prisoners? How many guards? What was being built? Where the weaknesses were? Network members in different work details reported what they saw. Slowly, Pilecki built a comprehensive understanding of Auschwitz's operations. Third, sabotage. Nothing dramatic that would cause mass reprisals, but small acts of resistance. Tools mysteriously breaking, work being done slowly or incorrectly, supplies disappearing. Each act was tiny, but accumulated, they disrupted the camp's efficiency. And fourth, the most important purpose: communication with the outside world. This was the most dangerous part of Pilecki's mission. He needed to send intelligence reports back to the resistance in Warsaw. But how? The camp was designed to prevent any communication. Mail was censored. Visitors were rare and monitored. The perimeter was sealed with electrified fences and guard towers. Pilecki found a way. He identified prisoners who worked outside the main camp. Some were assigned to work details in nearby towns. Some worked in SS administrative buildings. These prisoners had brief moments of contact with the outside world. Pilecki recruited them into his network. They would memorize messages and then pass them to civilian workers or friendly guards who could carry them beyond the camp. It was incredibly risky. If caught, everyone involved would be tortured and executed. But it worked. Beginning in November 1940, just 2 months after his arrival, Pilecki's intelligence reports began reaching Warsaw. These reports were extraordinary. Pilecki described everything: the systematic starvation, the brutal beatings, the medical experiments, the executions. He provided numbers: prisoner counts, death rates, guard strength. He described the camp's layout in detail. He identified SS officers by name. And most importantly, he reported on something the outside world didn't yet understand: the systematic mass murder of Jews. In 1941, Auschwitz began transforming from a prison camp into a death factory. The SS built gas chambers disguised as shower rooms. They installed crematoria to burn bodies. Trains began arriving filled with Jewish prisoners from across Europe. These prisoners weren't assigned numbers. They weren't registered. They were taken directly from the trains to the gas chambers and murdered. He reported all of this. His intelligence documents described the genocide in detail. He estimated the numbers being killed. He described how the system worked. He begged the resistance to inform the Allies, to launch rescue operations, to bomb the railways leading to Auschwitz, to do something, anything, to stop the mass murder. But here is where Pilecki's story becomes truly tragic. The outside world didn't believe him.
Pilecki's intelligence reports reached Warsaw. From there, they were passed to the Polish government in exile in London. From London, they were shared with British and American intelligence services. The information was accurate, detailed, and absolutely horrifying. And almost nobody believed it. The problem wasn't that the reports were secret. They weren't. By 1942, Pilecki's intelligence about Auschwitz had reached the highest levels of Allied governments. British Prime Minister Winston Churchill had been informed. American President Franklin Roosevelt knew. The information was even published in newspapers, but people couldn't accept it. The scale of the atrocities Pilecki described seemed impossible. Mass murder of thousands of people per day? Industrial facilities designed specifically for genocide? It seemed like propaganda, like exaggeration. Surely the Germans, a civilized European nation, wouldn't do such things. Surely this was Polish resistance trying to generate sympathy for their cause. All Allied military leaders were skeptical for another reason. They were focused on winning the war. Diverting resources to rescue operations seemed strategically questionable. Bombing Auschwitz would require long-range bombers flying deep into enemy territory. Those bombers were needed for bombing German industry and military targets. The calculation was cold and brutal. The fastest way to end the Holocaust was to defeat Germany militarily. Therefore, all resources should focus on that goal. Inside Auschwitz, Pilecki and his network continued their work. By 1942, his organization had grown substantially. Estimates suggest he had recruited between 500 to 1,000 prisoners into his resistance network. This was extraordinary, a secret army operating inside hell itself. The network continued gathering intelligence. They continued supporting each other. They continued small acts of sabotage. But Pilecki was growing frustrated. He had sent report after report describing the genocide. He had begged for action, and nothing was happening. The trains kept arriving. The gas chambers kept operating. The death toll kept climbing. Pilecki proposed a desperate plan, an uprising inside Auschwitz. The idea was this: Pilecki's network would seize control of sections of the camp. They would arm themselves with weapons stolen from guards or improvised from tools. They would hold out long enough for outside resistance forces to attack the camp from the exterior. Together, they would overwhelm the guards, free the prisoners, and destroy the extermination facilities. It was an incredibly dangerous plan. The SS had machine guns, trained soldiers, and overwhelming firepower. Any uprising would result in massive casualties, but Pilecki believed it was better to die fighting than to allow the genocide to continue. He sent messages to Warsaw. Can you support an uprising? Can you attack from outside while we attack from inside? Can you send weapons? The answer came back: no. The Home Army didn't have the resources. They were fighting their own battles across occupied Poland. They couldn't spare troops or weapons for an attack on Auschwitz. An uprising without external support would be suicide. It would result in the death of everyone involved and accomplish nothing. Pilecki was devastated. He had spent nearly 3 years inside Auschwitz. He had built a network. He had sent detailed reports. He had proposed action, and nothing had changed. The genocide continued. In 1943, Pilecki made another decision. If the resistance wouldn't support an uprising, and if the outside world wouldn't act on his reports, then he needed to escape. He needed to deliver his intelligence in person, to make people understand, to force them to act.
By April 1943, Witold Pilecki had been prisoner 4859 for 2 years and 7 months. He had survived conditions that killed most prisoners within months. He had built a resistance network of hundreds. He had sent detailed intelligence reports, and he had reached a conclusion. He needed to escape. Escaping Auschwitz was extraordinarily difficult. The camp was surrounded by multiple layers of electrified barbed wire fences. Guard towers with searchlights and machine guns covered every approach. German Shepherd dogs patrolled the perimeter. Guards were authorized to shoot anyone approaching the fences. And even if you somehow got past all of that, you were still in occupied Poland.
German patrols covered the surrounding area. Local populations were terrorized into reporting any escapees. The odds of successfully escaping and surviving were microscopic. But Pilecki had advantages. His network included prisoners assigned to work details outside the main camp. One detail worked at a bakery in the nearby town of Babice. These prisoners left the camp each morning under guard and returned each evening. If Pilecki could join this detail, and if he could overpower the guards, and if he could disappear before reinforcements arrived, he might have a chance. Pilecki recruited two trusted network members for the escape, Jan Redje and Edward Cieselski. Both were strong, experienced, and absolutely reliable. They spent weeks planning every detail, studying guard routines, identifying the best moment, preparing civilian clothes hidden in the bakery, gathering food and money, planning an escape route through the countryside. On the night of April 26 to 27, 1943, everything was ready. Pilecki, Redje, and Cieselski were assigned to the bakery work detail. They were marched out of the camp under guard in the early evening. At the bakery, they worked through the night. Guards watched them, but less intensely than inside the camp. The guards were tired, bored, expecting no trouble. At 2 a.m., the moment came. The guards were at their least alert. Some were dozing, others were distracted. Pilecki gave the signal. He and his companions attacked. They overpowered the guards quickly and silently. No shots were fired, no alarms were raised. They grabbed documents and weapons from the unconscious guards. They changed into the civilian clothes they had hidden in the bakery, and then they ran. They had perhaps 30 minutes before the alarm would be raised, maybe an hour. They needed to get as far from the camp as possible before German search parties mobilized. They ran through the darkness, through fields, through forests, not stopping, barely slowing. Their bodies were weakened from 3 years of starvation and brutal labor, but adrenaline and desperate hope drove them forward. By dawn, they had covered perhaps 10 miles. They hid in a forest, lying completely still while German patrols passed nearby. Soldiers shouted. Dogs barked. The search was intense, but the escapees remained hidden. For the next 2 days, they traveled only at night, moving slowly, carefully, avoiding roads, avoiding people. They had stolen documents that identified them as Polish workers authorized to travel, but at any moment they could be stopped and questioned. Any mistake would mean capture and certain execution. On April 30th, after 4 days of constant danger, they finally reached Warsaw. They made contact with the Home Army. They were safe, or at least as safe as anyone could be in occupied Poland. Witold Pilecki had accomplished something extraordinary. He had infiltrated Auschwitz. He had survived for nearly 3 years. He had built a resistance network of hundreds. He had sent detailed intelligence reports, and he had reached a conclusion. Now came the hardest part, making the world listen. In Warsaw, Pilecki immediately began working on a comprehensive report. This wasn't a brief intelligence summary. This was a detailed, systematic documentation of everything he had witnessed in Auschwitz. The organizational structure, the methods of killing, the numbers of dead, the names of SS officers responsible, the operation of the gas chambers, the disposal of bodies. Everything. The report, known as Witold's report, was over 100 pages long. It was the most comprehensive documentation of the Holocaust that existed at that time. Pilecki wrote it knowing that this might be his most important contribution, more important than the resistance network, more important than the intelligence he'd sent. This report would prove undeniably what was happening. The report was finished in August 1943. It was sent to the Polish government in exile in London. From there, it was shared with British and American intelligence. Once again, Pilecki waited for action. Once again, nothing happened. The reasons were complex. By 1943, Allied intelligence had multiple sources confirming the Holocaust. They knew it was happening. But military priorities dominated all decision-making. The Allied strategy was to defeat Germany through military force. Bombing Auschwitz, mounting rescue operations, diverting resources, these were all seen as distractions from the main objective. There was also a darker reality. Anti-Semitism existed even among the Allies. Some officials simply didn't care much about Jewish deaths. Some believed that publicizing the Holocaust would make the war seem like it was being fought specifically to save Jews, which they thought would reduce public support. These were ugly, shameful calculations, but they were real. Pilecki was devastated. He had volunteered for hell. He had survived the impossible. He had documented everything, and still, the world did nothing. But Witold Pilecki wasn't finished fighting. If he couldn't stop the Holocaust directly, he would continue fighting the Germans in every way possible. In August 1944, his opportunity came: the Warsaw Uprising. The Warsaw Uprising was one of the most dramatic and tragic events of World War II. As Soviet forces approached Warsaw from the east, the Polish Home Army decided to launch an uprising to liberate the city before the Soviets arrived. The goal was to establish Polish authority and prevent Soviet domination after the war. On August 1, 1944, 40,000 Home Army fighters attacked German positions across Warsaw. For the first few days, the uprising succeeded. Polish forces captured large sections of the city. The Polish flag flew over Warsaw for the first time since 1939. Liberation seemed possible. Then, the Germans counterattacked. Hitler, angered by the uprising, ordered Warsaw completely destroyed. Elite SS units and Wehrmacht divisions were sent into the city. They advanced block by block, building by building, using tanks, artillery, and flamethrowers. It became urban warfare at its most brutal. Witold Pilecki fought throughout the uprising. He commanded resistance fighters in some of the most intense combat. For 63 days, the battle raged. The Polish fighters were running out of ammunition, food, and hope. The Soviets, just across the Vistula River, could see Warsaw burning, but they didn't help. Stalin wanted the Home Army destroyed so Soviet-controlled communists could dominate Poland after the war. So the Soviets simply waited while the Germans systematically destroyed the uprising. On October 2, 1944, the Warsaw Uprising ended in defeat. 16,000 Home Army fighters were dead. 200,000 civilians were killed. The Germans had demolished 85% of Warsaw. The survivors, including Pilecki, were taken prisoner in the camp. Pilecki was sent to a prisoner of war camp in Germany, but unlike Auschwitz, this was a legitimate POW camp protected by the Geneva Convention. The conditions were harsh, but not death camp conditions. Pilecki survived until the camp was liberated by American forces in May 1945. World War II was over. Germany had been defeated. The concentration camps were liberated. The full horror of the Holocaust was finally revealed to the world. Pilecki's reports had been accurate. Everything he had described was true. Everything he had begged people to believe. Pilecki could finally go home, back to Poland, back to his wife and children, back to peace after 6 years of war. But Poland was no longer free, and Witold Pilecki's greatest trial was still ahead.
When Pilecki returned to Poland in 1945,
he found a country transformed. The Germans were gone, but Soviet forces occupied the country. A communist government, controlled by Moscow, was being imposed on Poland. The Home Army, which had fought for Polish independence, was being systematically destroyed. Many of Pilecki's fellow resistance fighters faced a terrible choice: accept communist rule or continue fighting. Some chose to accept it, hoping to work within the system. Some fled to the West, and some continued fighting, launching an underground resistance against the communist government. Pilecki could have left Poland. He could have gone to London, to America, to safety. The Allies would have welcomed him. He was a war hero. He had survived Auschwitz. He had fought throughout the war. He could have lived comfortably in the West, telling his story, receiving recognition for his courage. Instead, he chose to stay and to fight. Pilecki believed that Poland had not been truly liberated. Germany had been defeated, but Soviet domination was just another form of occupation. The Home Army had fought for a free, independent Poland, not for a Poland controlled by Moscow. So Pilecki joined the underground resistance against the communist government. He gathered intelligence on Soviet military positions. He reported on communist security forces. He maintained networks among former Home Army members. He hoped that the Western Allies would eventually confront the Soviets and support Polish independence. It was a desperate hope, but Pilecki had built his life on doing the impossible. The communist security services, controlled by Soviet advisors, viewed former Home Army members as enemies of the state. They were systematically hunted down, arrested, tortured, executed, or sent to gulags. The same men who had fought the Nazis were now being destroyed by the communists. On May 8, 1947, Witold Pilecki was arrested. The security forces had been tracking him for months. They knew about his resistance activities. They knew about his intelligence gathering. They wanted to make an example of him, to show that even the greatest heroes of the anti-Nazi resistance could be destroyed. Pilecki was taken to Mokotów prison in Warsaw, the same prison where the Gestapo had tortured prisoners during German occupation. Now it was operated by Polish communists under Soviet control. The torturers had changed. The methods had not. Pilecki was interrogated for months. They wanted him to confess to being a Western spy, to confess to planning terrorism, to name other resistance members. He was beaten savagely, sleep-deprived, tortured in ways that left no visible marks. The interrogators were professionals. They had learned from the Gestapo and the Soviet NKVD. But Pilecki had survived Auschwitz. He had survived 3 years of Nazi death camp brutality. The communist interrogators, as vicious as they were, couldn't break him in ways the SS hadn't already tried. On March 3, 1948, Pilecki was put on trial. It was a show trial. The verdict had been decided in advance. The prosecution accused him of espionage, of planning terrorism, of working for foreign powers. They presented forced confessions from tortured prisoners as evidence. Pilecki's defense was simple. I fought for Poland's freedom. I fought the Germans. I survived Auschwitz. I fought in the Warsaw Uprising. Everything I did was for Poland. The judges,
following orders from above, didn't care. On May 15th, 1948, they announced the verdict. Guilty. Sentence: death. Witold Pilecki had survived the impossible. He had volunteered for Auschwitz and survived. He had built a resistance network in hell. He had escaped. He had fought throughout the war. And now, 3 years after the war ended, he was sentenced to death by the country he had fought to save. On May 25th, 1948, at 9:30 p.m., in the basement of Mokotów prison, Witold Pilecki was executed by a shot to the back of the head. He was 47 years old.
After Pilecki's execution, the communist government attempted to erase him from history. His name was forbidden in Poland. His accomplishments were classified as state secrets. His family was persecuted. His wife, Maria, and their children lived under constant surveillance. Simply being related to Witold Pilecki was dangerous. His body was buried in an unmarked grave. The location was kept secret. His family wasn't allowed to know where he was buried. They couldn't mourn properly. They couldn't visit his grave. It was as if the government wanted to make him disappear completely. His reports from Auschwitz remained classified. The detailed documentation of his 3 years inside the death camp was locked away in government archives. Researchers couldn't access it. Historians couldn't study it. The world didn't know about one of the most extraordinary first-hand accounts of the Holocaust. For decades, Witold Pilecki remained unknown. While other heroes of World War II were celebrated, honored, remembered, Pilecki was forgotten. The man who had voluntarily entered Auschwitz, who had built a resistance network inside hell, who had sent the first detailed intelligence reports about the Holocaust, this man was erased from history. This wasn't accidental. The communist government had specific reasons for suppressing Pilecki's story. First, he was a member of the Home Army, which the communists considered enemies. They couldn't allow Home Army members to be celebrated as heroes. That would undermine the communist narrative. Second, Pilecki's story emphasized Polish suffering and Polish resistance during the war. The communists wanted to emphasize Soviet liberation of Poland. They didn't want stories about Polish independence fighters who had opposed both the Nazis and the Soviets. Third, and perhaps most cynically, acknowledging Pilecki's accomplishments would have raised uncomfortable questions. Why had the Allies not acted on his intelligence reports? Why had Auschwitz not been bombed? Why had the genocide been allowed to continue despite detailed warnings? These were questions that neither Communist Poland nor the Western Allies wanted to confront. So, Pilecki remained forgotten. His family lived in fear and poverty. His name could not be spoken. His sacrifice was denied. This continued for 40 years. Not until 1989, when communist rule finally ended in Poland, did the truth begin to emerge. As Poland transitioned to democracy, secret police archives were gradually opened. Researchers began finding documents, files about Pilecki's mission, his reports from Auschwitz, records of his arrest and execution. Slowly, the full story was revealed. In 1990, the military court that had sentenced Pilecki to death was declared illegal. In 1995, Pilecki was officially exonerated. His conviction was overturned. He was recognized as a victim of communist oppression. But this was nearly 50 years after his execution. 50 years too late.
In 2006, Pilecki was awarded the Order of the White Eagle, Poland's highest decoration. In 2013, he was promoted posthumously to colonel. Streets, schools, and memorials were named after him. His story began to be taught in Polish schools. But recognition came slowly in the West. While Pilecki's story was being rediscovered in Poland, he remained largely unknown in Britain, America, and other Allied countries. The first English translation of his Auschwitz report wasn't published until 2012. His full biography wasn't widely available until years later. Even today, many people have never heard of Witold Pilecki. If you asked random people in Britain or America to name heroes of World War II, they might mention Churchill, Eisenhower, Patton, various well-known figures. But Pilecki, the man who voluntarily entered Auschwitz, who built a resistance network inside hell, who had sent the first detailed intelligence reports about the Holocaust, this man was erased from history. This represents a profound historical injustice, not just to Pilecki himself, but to our understanding of the Holocaust and World War II. Pilecki's story demonstrates that people knew about the Holocaust while it was happening. Detailed, accurate intelligence was available. The Allies were informed, and they chose not to act. This is uncomfortable truth, but it's truth we need to understand. His story also demonstrates the extraordinary courage of resistance fighters. Pilecki wasn't a professional soldier or elite special forces operator. He was a farmer and cavalry officer, an ordinary man who chose to do something extraordinary, because he believed it was necessary, because someone had to do it. And perhaps most importantly, his story demonstrates the continuing costs of totalitarianism. Pilecki survived Nazi genocide only to be murdered by communist tyranny. The fact that he was executed by his own country for fighting for that country's freedom represents one of the great tragedies of the 20th century. Today, more than 75 years after his death, Witold Pilecki's legacy is finally being recognized. But recognition isn't enough. We need to understand what his story teaches us, and those lessons remain powerfully relevant today. First, Pilecki's story teaches us about moral courage. He volunteered for a mission that was nearly certain death, not for personal glory, not for recognition. He didn't even expect to survive to receive recognition. He did it because he believed it was necessary, because gathering intelligence about Auschwitz might save lives, because someone had to document what was happening. That kind of courage, doing what's right regardless of personal cost, is extremely rare. Second, his story demonstrates the power and limitations of individual action. Pilecki accomplished extraordinary things. He survived Auschwitz. He built a resistance network. He gathered vital intelligence. But he couldn't stop the Holocaust. Not because he didn't try, not because his intelligence was wrong, but because the people with the power to act chose not to. This is perhaps the most tragic aspect of Pilecki's story. He did everything humanly possible. He risked everything. He suffered unimaginably. And still, the trains kept arriving at Auschwitz. The gas chambers kept operating. The genocide continued. Not because of his failure, but because of the world's failure to respond. Third, Pilecki's story teaches us about the importance of historical memory. For
For decades, his accomplishments were deliberately erased. A generation of Poles grew up not knowing about this hero. When history is suppressed, we lose not just facts, but lessons. We lose examples of courage that might inspire others. We lose uncomfortable truths that we need to confront. The suppression of Pilecki's story served multiple political purposes, but ultimately it impoverished our understanding of the war, the Holocaust, and human courage. Only now, decades later, are we finally recovering that understanding. Fourth, his story reminds us about the dangers of totalitarianism. Pilecki fought against Nazi tyranny. He survived 3 years in their death camp, and then he was executed by communist tyranny. 2 different ideologies, 2 different systems, but both willing to murder people they viewed as threats, both willing to suppress truth, both willing to erase history. Pilecki's execution by the communist government represents the same brutal logic that created Auschwitz. The belief that individuals are expendable, that the state's interests override human rights, that dissent must be crushed. Whether carried out in the name of racial purity or communist revolution, tyranny remains tyranny. Fifth, and perhaps most relevant today, Pilecki's story teaches us about the importance of believing and acting on intelligence about atrocities. Pilecki sent detailed reports about the Holocaust. Those reports reached the highest levels of Allied governments. They were accurate. They were urgent. They were ignored. Why? Because people couldn't believe such things were possible. Because military priorities took precedence. Because political considerations complicated responses. These were all understandable reasons, but they were wrong. Today, we still receive reports of atrocities from around the world. Genocide in various regions, systematic oppression, crimes against humanity, and too often, the international response is inadequate. We express concern. We issue statements. But meaningful action is rare. Pilecki's story reminds us that knowing about atrocities creates moral responsibility. Saying we didn't know is no longer an excuse when detailed intelligence is available. The question becomes, what are we willing to do with that knowledge? Finally, Pilecki's story teaches us about the complexity of heroism. He wasn't perfect. He made decisions that could be questioned. His plan for an uprising in Auschwitz could have resulted in massive casualties for no gain. His decision to continue fighting after the war led directly to his execution and left his family suffering. But heroism isn't about perfection. It's about choosing to act when action is difficult and dangerous. It's about maintaining moral principles under extreme pressure. It's about refusing to accept injustice even when fighting it seems hopeless. By these standards, Witold Pilecki was unquestionably heroic. He could have stayed home with his family in 1940. He could have hidden during the roundup. He could have avoided Auschwitz entirely. Once inside, he could have focused solely on his own survival. After escaping, he could have fled to safety in the West. After the war, he could have accepted communist rule or left Poland. At every decision point, Pilecki chose the harder path, the more dangerous path. the path that served others rather than himself. And ultimately, that's what defines true heroism.
Witold Pilecki's story isn't just history. It's a testament to the best and worst of humanity. The best, one man's extraordinary courage, sacrifice, and moral conviction. The worst, the world's failure to act on his intelligence and his ultimate execution by the country he fought to save. Today, Pilecki is finally receiving recognition. Memorials exist in Poland and beyond. Books have been written about him. His Auschwitz report is studied by historians. But recognition, while important, isn't enough. We need to learn from his story. We need to ask uncomfortable questions. Why didn't the Allies bomb Auschwitz when they had detailed intelligence about what was happening? Why did military priorities consistently override humanitarian concerns? Why did Polish resistance fighters, who risked everything to defeat the Nazis, end up persecuted by the communists? These aren't just historical questions. They're questions about moral responsibility, about the choices individuals and nations make when confronting evil, about the price of courage and the cost of inaction. Pilecki's voluntarism is perhaps the most striking aspect of his story. He wasn't ordered to infiltrate Auschwitz. He wasn't forced. He volunteered, knowing the probable outcome, knowing he might not survive, but believing the mission was necessary. In an age when people often ask, "What can one person do?" Pilecki's story provides an answer. One person can accomplish extraordinary things. One person can resist even in hell itself. One person can maintain moral principles under imaginable pressure. One person can choose courage over safety, sacrifice over survival, purpose over comfort. But his story also reminds us of human limitations. Even extraordinary individual courage isn't always enough. Pilecki did everything possible and still couldn't stop the Holocaust. Because stopping genocide requires collective action. It requires nations to prioritize human rights over political convenience. It requires leaders to make difficult decisions. It requires the world to say never again and actually mean it. Pilecki's death represents one of the great injustices of the 20th century. A man who voluntarily entered Auschwitz to fight evil was executed as a criminal by his own country. A man who documented the Holocaust was erased from history for 40 years. A man who embodied courage and sacrifice was forgotten while others received accolades. But now we know his story, and knowing it, we have a responsibility to remember, to teach, to ask what we would do in similar circumstances, to recognize that extraordinary courage is possible, that individuals matter, that moral choices remain meaningful even when the odds are overwhelming. The Polish historian Norman Davies said of Pilecki that if there was an Allied hero who deserved to be remembered and celebrated, it was Witold Pilecki. But he was not. He was condemned, tortured, and murdered by the country he had fought to liberate. This is true,
And it's a condemnation not just of communist Poland, but of all of us who forget such sacrifices. Witold Pilecki volunteered for hell. He survived the impossible. He documented genocide. He fought throughout the war, and he paid the ultimate price for his courage. His story should be as well known as any hero of World War II. It should be taught in schools, studied by military officers, remembered by anyone who values courage and sacrifice. Because ultimately, Witold Pilecki represents the best of humanity, the capacity for selfless courage, the refusal to accept injustice, the determination to fight even when the odds are overwhelming, the belief that some things are worth dying for. His body was buried in an unmarked grave and has never been found, but his legacy, the example he set, cannot be buried. It remains as powerful